The soft click of my old recorder was still humming on the table when my son Andrew whispered my name like a curse. Still, I kept my fingers resting on the device, letting its quiet vibration steady me the way a father shouldn't need to around his own child. As the hum deepened in the silence, it felt less like a sound and more like the truth I'd ignored about our broken bond. While I listened, I realized the betrayal wasn't sudden, only my willingness to see who my son had become. The same soft click reminded me I wasn't powerless, not even against my own blood. That's when I decided, justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it records. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Walter Jennings had rehearsed this conversation in his mind for 3 days straight, pacing the kitchen floor in the early mornings while the coffee pot hissed behind him. He told himself he'd stay calm, measured, respectful, the way he had always tried to be as a father. The budget sheet lay neatly folded on the coffee table, waiting like a quiet truth he could no longer avoid. When he sent the text inviting Andrew over, he told himself it was simply a talk, a reasonable conversation between a father and son. But deep down, he felt something tightening in his chest, as if the walls of the home he'd built were bracing themselves for a storm. Andrew didn't knock when he arrived. He shoved the door open with the heel of his hand, stepping inside with the agitation of someone already prepared for war. Walt could smell the frustration on him before he even spoke. The restless breathing, the heavy footsteps, the irritated exhale as he tossed his keys onto the entryway table. Andrew didn't sit. He didn't even pretend to. He paced immediately, dragging his hand across the back of the sofa, across the wall, across the family photos as if the house itself annoyed him. His jaw flexed in sharp bursts. His eyes darted toward the budget sheet as though it were an insult. Melissa followed him in a moment later, but unlike Andrew, she moved slowly, deliberately, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She positioned herself on the single chair across from Walt, legs crossed neatly, gaze sharp and clinical. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of pressure, as if she were studying Walt the way a lawyer studies a witness before cross-examination. Walt cleared his throat, feeling the strain of their energy settle like dust around him. He forced a small smile and gestured toward the sofa, though he already knew Andrew wouldn't take it. "Son," he said gently, "I wanted to talk about the budgeting issues you mentioned last month. I spent some time looking over the numbers, and I think we need to make a plan going forward." Andrew barked out a humorless laugh and kept pacing. "A plan? Dad, I didn't come here for a lecture about budgeting. I came for what I asked for." Melissa's eyes flicked toward Andrew, then toward Walt, quietly calculating. Walt inhaled slowly. "Andrew, I can't give you another loan." The word "can't" was the fuse. It lit instantly. Andrew stopped mid-step, his shoes scraping the hardwood floor. His head whipped toward Walt, and his face hardened into something Walt didn't recognize. Not his son, not the boy he raised, not the man he hoped Andrew would become. "Are you kidding me?" Andrew snapped. "You're sitting on savings on the house, on everything Grandpa left you, and you're telling me you ca." Walt opened his palms, keeping his voice steady. "I've given you more help than I ever planned to, and I'm not unkind, but I can't keep bailing you out. It's hurting you, and frankly, it's hurting me." Melissa shifted, and Walt caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Subtle, controlled. A flicker of satisfaction she quickly covered by placing a hand gently on Andrew's arm. "Andrew," she said softly, though her eyes stayed on Walt unblinking, "let's just stay calm. He's old. He doesn't understand how hard things are now." The words stung, not because they called him old, but because they stripped him of dignity so efficiently. Walt straightened. "I understand enough." But Andrew didn't hear him. Or maybe he refused to. His face reddened, his breaths quickened, and he took a step toward Walt, finger pointed, voice rising from anger to something uglier. "You know what?" Andrew shouted. "Your money belongs to me, you old fool." The words slashed through the room like broken glass. Walt didn't move, didn't flinch. He let the silence sit for a moment, let the echo of his son's rage hang in the air long enough for even Melissa's mask to falter. She recovered quickly, plastering on an expression of forced concern as she whispered, "Andrew, honey, calm down, you're scaring him." But Walt saw the truth, the satisfaction under her feigned composure. They thought he was powerless. They thought they could frighten him into compliance. Walt slowly reached one hand into his pocket, pressing his thumb against the small silver recorder he had switched on the moment they arrived. A soft, almost imperceptible click confirmed it was still running, capturing every word, every accusation, every insult. He said nothing about it. He kept his face blank, almost tired, letting them believe they had shaken him. Andrew resumed pacing, muttering under his breath. Melissa stood, smoothing her blouse, pretending the situation was under control. But Walt felt something shift inside him, not fear, not despair. Something firmer, something steady. The recording was still running. And this was only the beginning. The front door slammed so hard the frame vibrated, and before Walt could even stand, Andrew's arm swept across the small wooden table beside it. The picture of Martha, his late wife, his anchor, the gentle smile he still whispered good nights to, flew off the edge and cracked against the hardwood floor. The glass shattered into several sharp pieces, scattering across the entryway like frozen tears. Andrew didn't look back, didn't apologize, didn't even pause. He stormed down the steps and into the cold afternoon, letting the raw sound of his footsteps fade into the street. Melissa lingered behind, her expression carved from something colder than anger, calculating, composed. She stepped around the broken frame as if it were an inconvenience, not a wound. Leaning in just enough so only Walt could hear, she whispered, "We'll get it one way or another." The words were delivered softly, almost politely, but they carried the chill of a promise, not a threat. She turned and exited with a serene poise, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than Andrew's slam. For a moment the house fell into an eerie stillness. Walt stood there staring at the shattered photo, feeling his pulse thudding in his neck. His hands trembled, not with fear exactly, but with the weight of something shifting under his feet. Betrayal had a sound. It wasn't the shouting. It wasn't the slammed door. It was that whisper, quiet, controlled, deliberate. He bent down slowly, picking up the fractured frame, careful not to cut himself on the glass. Martha's face stared back at him from beneath the crack running across her eyes. "I'm sorry, honey," he murmured to her image. "I didn't think he'd go this far." He rose, locked the door firmly, turning the deadbolt with a sense of finality. The metal clicked into place, but it did little to lock out the sinking realization that this confrontation wasn't over. If anything, it had just graduated into something darker. Before he could sweep the glass or steady his breath, he heard hurried footsteps outside, then a familiar knock, 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Carl Benton. The old Vietnam vet lived next door, and at 74 his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he could still pick up the vibrations of trouble like a weathered antenna tuned to human storms. Walt opened the door just enough for Carl's lined face to appear under the brim of his faded ball cap. "You all right, Walt?" Carl asked, voice rough but sincere. "Heard some yelling, thought maybe Andrew slipped and cracked his skull on the driveway. Wouldn't have surprised me much." Walt managed a strained smile. "I'm fine, just a disagreement." Carl's eyes drifted past him to the broken frame on the floor. His expression softened. "Hell of a disagreement." Walt swallowed. "Yeah." "You need me to stay a bit," Carl offered. "Not to pry, just I don't like the tone Andrew's been carrying these days." The kindness nearly broke Walt. "I'll be all right, thank you, Carl." The old man gave a slow nod, lingering a moment as if wanting to say more, but eventually he patted Walt's arm and stepped back toward his yard. Walt closed the door gently this time. Inside, the silence pressed in again, heavy and intimate. He slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out the small recorder. For a moment, he hesitated, thumb hovering over the playback button. Part of him feared hearing the words again, feared confirming that what he felt wasn't an exaggeration but the truth he'd been avoiding for years. He pressed play. Andrew's voice erupted instantly, raw and venomous. "Your money belongs to me, you old fool." Then Melissa's voice, low, amused, predatory. Walt let the recording finish, let the ugliness wash over him like cold water. The evidence was there, unfiltered, undeniable. Not a misunderstanding, not a moment of frustration, a reveal of who they had chosen to be. His phone buzzed. He looked down and saw Andrew's name, followed by a barrage of messages. "You owe me, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. If you don't send the money, I swear you'll regret it." The venom was digital now, but it carried the same heat as his shouting. Walt exhaled shakily, feeling the air grow thinner around. Him. His world, once steady, once predictable, had shifted on its axis. He felt the ground tilting beneath him, pushing him toward a conflict he never asked for but couldn't walk away from. He locked his phone, placed the recorder on the table, and stood in the quiet of his living room, broken glass, fractured memories and all. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. And Walt could feel it in his bones. Andrew wasn't done, not even close. Walt wasn't expecting company that morning. He was still sweeping away the last slivers of glass from Martha's shattered photo frame, moving slowly, carefully when the knock came. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, polite in a way that instantly felt suspicious. Andrew never knocked politely. And Melissa, well, Melissa didn't knock unless she wanted something. Walt wiped his hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, his breath tightening as he opened it. There she was. Melissa Jennings stood on his porch with a smile so delicate it could have been lifted from a sympathy card. Her coat was pressed, her makeup soft and neutral, her posture almost humble. But humility never fit her well. It always looked like a costume. "Walt," she said warmly, stepping forward as though waiting for him to welcome her inside, "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Things got emotional." Her eyes glimmered in a way that suggested the opposite. Walt stepped aside only because blocking the doorway felt confrontational, and he didn't want to start a scene. She slipped past him, inhaling the air like she was reacquainting herself with territory she planned to occupy. Inside, she moved slowly, her gaze drifting, not to Walt, not even to the broom still propped against the wall, but to the mantel, the antique clock, the framed medals from Walt's service days. Her eyes lingered on the old cherrywood cabinet he inherited from his father, the one containing meticulously kept financial records. She wasn't admiring. She was scanning, cataloging, assigning value. Walt felt his jaw tighten. "Coffee?" he asked, if only to interrupt her silent inventory. "Oh no," she replied sweetly, "I won't be long." She perched on the edge of the sofa with the elegance of someone auditioning for a role. Walt stayed standing. "I really am sorry for how Andrew behaved," she began, folding her hands as though she were pure sincerity. "He was overwhelmed, work stress, bills, you know how it is." Walt didn't answer. He watched her carefully. Her eyes, still wandering, landed on the family photo that survived yesterday's blow. For half a heartbeat, something smug flickered across her face. Melissa sighed dramatically. "I just think Andrew expected more support from you. You're his father." "Support," Walt said quietly. "I've supported him more times than he can count." Her smile didn't waver. "Yes, but now he needs stability, your stability." The phrasing was deliberate. Walt felt a cold ripple travel down his spine. "Melissa, what are you trying to say?" She looked at her hands, feigning hesitation. "I probably shouldn't say this. I don't want you to worry. Then she lifted her gaze, sympathetic in the way a wolf is sympathetic to a trapped deer. Andrew's been talking to a lawyer. Walt didn't move. He thinks, she continued softly, that maybe he needs to take legal steps to make sure you're taken care of properly. She let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Guardianship. Control. The same tactic he'd heard about from families torn apart by greed. Walt forced himself to breathe. I don't need anyone taking care of me. I know you don't think you do, she replied gently, but appearances matter, and sometimes judges see differently than we do. There it was, not a threat, a warning wrapped in silk. Walt straightened, meeting her eyes fully for the first time. Melissa, I'm not discussing my estate, not with you, not with Andrew, that's final. Her smile faltered, revealing the metal beneath. You're being unreasonable. Walt's voice sharpened, the steel in it surprising even him. It's my life, my home, my decision, and I'm done entertaining this conversation. For the first time since she entered the house, Melissa's expression cracked. Not fear, irritation. As if she were annoyed he wasn't bending easily. She rose without another word and glided to the door. Fine, she whispered, have it your way. She stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around her, and crossed the porch with brisk, clipped steps. Walt watched her walk toward her car, waiting for her to leave. But she didn't. Instead, she paused at the edge of the driveway, pulled out her phone, and angled it toward the house. A tiny click echoed in the cool morning air, then another, and another. She photographed the porch, the walkway, the siding, even the windows, methodical, slow, intentional. Walt's stomach tightened. He pushed open the screen door. Melissa, what are you doing? She lowered the phone, unfazed. Oh, nothing, she said. A bright, empty smile. Just documenting things. It's always smart to keep records. Then she slid into her car and drove off, leaving behind the sour taste of inevitability. Walt stood frozen in the doorway. The morning breeze rustled the leaves, but all he heard was the implication of those photos, the calculation in her eyes, the smile that didn't reach her heart. She hadn't been visiting to apologize. She had been surveying, gathering evidence, building something. And Andrew wasn't acting alone. They were preparing a case against him. A legal assault wrapped in family disguise. Walt closed the door slowly, the weight of the realization settling deep in his bones. They were coming. And now he knew it for certain. The Richmond air carried a winter sharpness that cut through Walt's coat as he stepped out of his truck and walked toward the brick law office on Broad Street. He had known Blake Morgan for nearly 40 years, through tax seasons, estate planning, and the handful of moments when life's storms made a lawyer feel more like a lifeline. Blake had always been steady, a man carved from oak and principle. Today, though, Walt wasn't sure anything could steady the unease twisting in his chest. Inside, the office smelled of paper, leather, and the kind of quiet that made bad news echo louder. Blake stepped out from behind a frosted glass door the moment he heard Walt's footsteps. "Walt," he greeted, gripping his shoulder with warm familiarity, "come on in. I cleared the morning for you." They settled into Blake's office, dark wood furniture, towering bookshelves, a framed certificate from the Virginia bar hanging beside a photo of Blake's kids fishing at Lake Gaston. Familiar, safe, but the expression on Blake's face wasn't familiar at all. "You sounded worried on the phone," Walt began cautiously. Blake exhaled, lacing his fingers together. "I am worried. You said Melissa was taking photos of your property." Walt nodded, and hinting that Andrew's talking to a lawyer. Blake didn't react with surprise. That scared Walt more than if he had. "Walt," Blake said slowly, "I need you to prepare yourself. Your son might try guardianship or forced asset transfer." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, rippling, sinking, irreversible. Walt blinked. "Guardianship over me." Blake leaned forward. "It's becoming more common. Adult children file claims that their aging parents are mentally unfit. If a judge buys the story, they can gain legal control of your bank accounts, your home, even your medical decisions. Walt stared at him, stunned. His mind flashed to Andrew pacing his living room, shouting about money, to Melissa photographing the exterior like she was preparing a real estate listing, to the whisper, "We'll get it one way or another." "My own son," Walt whispered. "I never thought he'd." "I know," Blake said gently, "but entitlement can warp people, especially when money's involved. And Melissa," he hesitated, "she's smarter than people realize, strategic, calculated." Walt looked down at his hands, hands that once lifted Andrew after scraped knees, hands that built swing sets and paid tuition and fixed broken things around the house. He felt foolish for believing the bond of blood would protect him. "What do I do, Blake? What's my next step?" "Document everything," Blake said immediately. "Every message, every voicemail, every threat. Keep that recorder close at all times. If they're building a case, you need to build a better one." Walt nodded slowly, grounding himself in the practical. "I already recorded what Andrew said yesterday." "That's good," Blake said, though his jaw clenched. "Very good. If they attempt guardianship, that recording could be the difference between losing your independence and keeping it." Walt felt a flicker of gratitude, small but steady. Blake reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "There's something else we should handle now. Your will." Walt's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "We need to remove Andrew temporarily," Blake said gently. "At least until you know what you're dealing with. If he's actively trying to undermine your autonomy, giving him direct access to your estate is dangerous." The sentence felt like sandpaper across Walt's heart. Cutting his son out of his will, even temporarily, felt like chiseling away a piece of himself. But the memory of Andrew's words, "Your money belongs to me," rose like smoke. "All right," Walt murmured, "do it." They spent the next half hour reviewing papers, updating signatures, restructuring the estate so that everything required multiple safeguards. Blake explained each step calmly, methodically, the way a doctor explains a difficult operation. Walt followed every instruction, even as grief pressed at the edges of his ribs. When it was done, Blake closed the folder. "You're safer now, not invincible but safer." Walt managed a small nod. "Thank you, Blake, really." As Walt left the office, he felt lighter. In one sense, protected by a friend who understood the law better than he ever could. But the emotional weight was heavier. Legal paperwork couldn't soften the bruise of knowing his son might see him as an obstacle instead of a father. On the drive home, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw Melissa's name. Against his better judgment, he opened the message. "Walt, I'm really worried about you. Andrew said you were confused yesterday. Please let us help before things get worse." A beautifully crafted lie, the tone gentle, the implication poisonous. Walt stared at the message, feeling the betrayal tighten like a knot being pulled with deliberate, patient force. Melissa wasn't guessing at what Andrew planned. She was orchestrating it. He placed the phone face down on the passenger seat, the road stretching ahead in a long, cold line. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was preparation. And the next move, he realized, would not come from him. The call from Blake came just after sunrise, when the sky was still bruised with deep blue and the neighborhood sat in its morning hush. Walt was halfway through brewing his coffee when the phone buzzed. Blake's name lit the screen, but his tone, tight, clipped, urgent, hit Walt harder than any ringtone ever could. "Walt," Blake said without greeting, "I need you to come in now." Walt's hand froze on the coffee pot. "What's wrong?" "It's about Andrew." A short pause. "We received something from the courthouse." Those words alone told Walt everything. Whatever had come in wasn't a question or a request or even a warning. It was a move. Walt didn't bother finishing the coffee. He grabbed his coat, slid the recorder into his pocket by reflex, and drove downtown with a heaviness in his chest that made the steering wheel feel twice as thick. Inside Blake's office, the manila envelope sat on the desk like a loaded weapon. Blake didn't ease into the news. He opened the folder and pushed the papers toward Walt. "Your son," Blake said carefully, "has filed for temporary guardianship." The world seemed to tilt. The words didn't register all at once. They came in pieces. "Your son filed guardianship," and hit Walt harder the second time. The paperwork was real, stamped, filed, official. "Temporary guardianship," Walt repeated, barely above a whisper. Blake nodded grimly. "He's claiming you're experiencing cognitive decline, that you're unable to manage your finances or make safe decisions for yourself." Walt felt heat rush to his face, not shame but disbelief. And something else, something sharper. "Decline? I passed every evaluation last year. My doctor said I was in excellent shape." Blake exhaled, jaw tight. "They included doctor reports in the filing." Walt blinked. "What doctor?" Blake flipped a page. "A Dr. Harold Gibbons." "I've never been to a Dr. Gibbons." "I know," Blake said. "The signatures are forged." Silence expanded in the room, thick as tar. Melissa. This had her fingerprints all over it. Her cold gaze, her calculated words, her talent for wrapping manipulation in silk. A slow, sinking realization washed through Walt's bones. The quiet dread of a man who had hoped things were merely bad, only to discover they were far worse. "So this is real," Walt murmured. "He actually wants legal control." Blake nodded. "Andrew is petitioning the court for immediate financial authority. If this goes through, he'd gain access to your bank accounts, retirement accounts, assets, and home equity. All of it." "All of it," Walt repeated hollowly. He felt something break inside, not a snap but a tear. The kind that comes from deep inside the heart where hope once lived. A father imagines his child taking his hand in old age, not taking his autonomy. His stomach tightened as he flipped through the pages. Andrew's signature, bold, confident, as though he believed he was doing the righteous thing. Melissa's handwriting in the supplemental statements, using phrases like unsafe, confused, inconsistent memory. Lies dressed in professional tone. "This isn't a misunderstanding," Blake said softly. "This is an attack." Walt swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" Blake leaned forward. "We respond. Immediately. I'll file an objection on your behalf, but we need witnesses. Solid testimony that you're mentally sharp." Walt let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Carl." "Yes," Blake said. "Your neighbor is perfect. The court trusts long-term observers. If Carl is willing, he can testify to your clarity, your independence, your routine." Walt nodded slowly. "He'll do it. He's seen me every day for years." Blake continued. "We'll also use the recording of Andrew yelling. It shows motive, financial desperation, and emotional volatility. Judges don't like to see an heir demanding money like that." Walt sat back, the weight of everything settling in. The pieces were clear: forged reports, false claims, a court filing designed to strip him of dignity. Andrew wasn't just thinking about legal action. He had already launched the first missile. Walt rubbed his temples, grief and anger intertwining like two incompatible wires sparking in the dark. "My son," he whispered. "My own son filed this." Blake lowered his voice. "Some people crumble under pressure, Walt. Others become dangerous." Walt closed the folder slowly, deliberately, as if sealing away the last bit of disbelief. When he finally looked up, the sorrow in his eyes had hardened into something else: determination. That was when Blake added, "Walt, you need to prepare for the hearing. They're coming full force." Walt's expression didn't waver. He drew a long breath, standing straighter, steadier, older in years but not in strength. "Blake," he said quietly, "this isn't just about money." "No," Blake agreed, "it never is." "It's about erasing me," Walt said, "and I won't let them do that." He closed the folder with a decisive thud. "If they want war," his voice deepened, strengthened, "I'll give them proof. Proof of his clarity. Proof of their greed. Proof of every lie they had crafted." As Walt walked out of the office, guardianship papers tucked under his arm, he understood one thing clearly. The battle had officially begun, and he wasn't stepping into it unarmed. The harassment didn't arrive all at once. It crept in piece by piece, like a slow leak spreading across a ceiling until the plaster sagged and finally split open. The first sign came as Walt was finishing dinner one evening, the sun already dipped behind the tree line. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. 3 voicemails in a row. He stared at the screen, knowing exactly who they were from, but hoping somehow they were. The first message hit him with immediate heat. "You think you can embarrass me in court?" Andrew growled, his voice thick with fury. "You're not gonna win this, old man. You owe me that money. I'm done asking." The second voicemail came seconds later, even darker. "You're confused, Dad. You don't know what you're doing. I'm trying to help you before you ruin everything." The third was the one that cut deepest. "If you won't cooperate voluntarily, the court will make you. One way or another, this ends with me in control." Walt let the phone drop to the table, his stomach tightening as though a fist had closed around it. His own son was speaking to him like a creditor collecting a debt, and not even politely, like a predator who believed he already owned the outcome. By the end of the week, the rot had spread beyond voicemail. Neighbors began approaching Walt with polite concern, asking if he was doing okay or if he needed help remembering appointments. One woman from down the street asked if he still drove safely at his age. Melissa's handiwork, subtle, poisonous, and effective. She didn't need evidence. She just needed whispers. Walt had lived in this neighborhood for decades, built trust with every backyard handshake and borrowed cup of sugar. Melissa knew exactly how to weaponize that trust against him. But nothing prepared him for the night he saw Andrew Liu arcing near his garage. It was just after 11. Walt stepped outside to take the trash out, the cold air stiff against his skin. As he rounded the corner, his porch light cast a faint glow across the driveway, and there, half hidden in the shadow beside the garage door, stood Andrew. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't moving, just standing, watching. "Andrew," Walt called, heart kicking hard. Andrew didn't flinch. For a moment he stared with an expression that wasn't anger or sadness, it was calculation. A man measuring something, a man waiting for opportunity. Then he turned and walked down the driveway without a single word. Walt locked every door in the house that night. The next morning, he drove straight to the Richmond Police Department and asked to speak with Detective Corinne Doyle. The officer Carl had once recommended, the one neighbors said knew the difference between a misunderstanding and a threat. Doyle listened carefully, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You need documentation," she said firmly. "Every voicemail, every rumor you can confirm, every sighting. If they escalate, we'll already have a trail." She tapped her pen on the desk. "Start recording timestamps, and Walt, don't confront them alone." Her confidence steadied him, not enough to erase the fear, but enough to give it structure. That afternoon, he went to the hardware store and purchased 3 motion-sensing security cameras. By evening, he had them mounted above the garage, the porch, and the backyard gate. He synced them to his phone, tested each angle twice, and sat in the dim light of his living room feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks: control. But the illusion didn't last long. 2 days later, a police cruiser pulled into his driveway. Walt stepped outside, nerves bristling. "Mr. Jennings," the officer asked, "we received a report from your son. He says you threatened him during a dispute." Walt stared at him, stunned. "Threatened? I haven't seen him since he tried to corner me in my own driveway." The officer gave a weary shrug. "We have to follow up. Mind if I ask what happened?" Walt didn't argue. He simply reached into his pocket and held up the recorder, the same one that captured Andrew's outburst, Melissa's whisper, and every moment since. Detective Doyle arrived 10 minutes later, having been alerted by radio that Walt was involved. She listened to the relevant audio clip, Andrew screaming, calling him a fool, demanding money. Doyle snapped the recorder off. "This report is false," she said flatly. "Melissa filed it, not Andrew. I'll make sure it goes nowhere but Walt. They're getting desperate." Walt nodded slowly. "I know." The cruisers pulled away, but the unease didn't. Because if Melissa had escalated to filing false police reports, then the battle wasn't approaching. It was here. And Walt could feel the next hit coming, even before he knew what shape it would take. Walt didn't notice anything wrong at first. It was a quiet morning, the kind where he tried to rebuild routine. Fresh coffee, local radio humming low in the background, a few minutes spent gazing out the window as the neighborhood woke. But when he stepped into his small home office to gather papers for Blake, something inside him halted. The drawer that always resisted opening, where he stored tax returns, investment binders, and estate files, slid too easily this time. Too light, too empty. Walt frowned and pulled it all the way open. Half the folders were gone. He knelt, checking the lower drawers. The binder containing his life insurance documents was missing. So was the folder of notarized updates Blake had given him 2 weeks earlier. Even the ledger where he tracked home maintenance expenses, a simple, handwritten record, had vanished. His pulse thudded in his ears. He hadn't misplaced them. He would never misplace documents like these. His office ran on meticulous order. Every paper had a home, every home a purpose. He rose slowly, a chill moving across his arms. Someone had been inside. He crossed the room and opened the security app on his phone. 3 camera feeds pulled up instantly. Porch, nothing. Garage, nothing. Backyard, nothing. But the 4th camera, the one tucked above the back mudroom door, had a motion alert from the night before. Walt tapped the thumbnail. The footage opened, grainy in the low light but clear enough. At 2:17 a.m. the back door eased open, not kicked or forced. The lock turned cleanly. A slim figure stepped inside, hood pulled up, face shadowed. She moved confidently, as though she knew the layout by heart. Her hair slipped out from the hood as she turned. "Melissa." She didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward the office hallway, moving with purpose, like someone who had rehearsed what she would take. She held a small flashlight under her chin, scanning shelves, drawers, documents. 15 minutes later, she slipped out the same way she had come, locking the door behind her. A copied key. She had a copied key. Walt lowered the phone, his breath shaky with a blend of disbelief, outrage, and something colder, clarity. Melissa wasn't guessing about his finances. She wasn't speculating about his condition. She was building a legal narrative from the inside out. And she was now inside his home. He drove to Andrew's house without calling first, without rehearsing what he'd say. The anger wasn't loud. It was tightly controlled, pressed deep beneath the ribs. The kind of anger that forms only after betrayal becomes undeniable. Andrew opened the door, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. "What?" Andrew snapped. "If this is about the voicemails." "You know exactly what this is about," Walt said evenly. Andrew blinked, momentarily thrown by his calmness. "What are you talking about?" "Melissa was in my house last night," Walt said. "She stole financial documents. I have her on camera." The mask cracked, just for a second. A flash of panic rippled across Andrew's face before he swallowed it, forcing indifference back into his expression. "You're imagining things," Andrew said. "You probably misplaced them." Walt didn't raise his voice. "She used a copied key." That landed harder. Andrew shifted, eyes narrowing, fists clenching at his sides. "You're spiraling, Dad," Andrew said harshly. "And frankly, this only proves our point. You're losing control. If you're not careful, people are going to think you need to be in a home." The words were so cold, so practiced, that Walt felt something inside him quietly close. Not break, close. A door that had once given Andrew endless access finally shut. He stood straighter. "Andrew, I recorded everything." The reaction was immediate. Andrew's eyes widened. His breath hitched. His posture stiffened like someone struck across the face. For a heartbeat, he was exposed, fear blooming in the space he usually filled with arrogance. But Andrew recovered just as quickly, forcing a shrug. "Recordings won't save you. You're confused, and you're making this worse for yourself." "I'll take my chances," Walt replied. He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. Andrew didn't follow. He didn't call after him. The silence behind Walt was louder than any shout. Back home, Walt didn't sit down. He didn't pace. He opened his laptop, uploaded the camera footage, and attached a short note. "Blake, this is what we're dealing with now. Use it however you need to. W." He hit send. The footage, a burglary, a violation, a blueprint of calculated fraud, was now in the hands of the one person who could weaponize it properly. As the email whooshed away, Walt exhaled, long and steady. The fear was still there, but something else had taken root beside it. Resolve. Because Melissa and Andrew had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now, finally, Walt could make his countermove. The call came mid-morning, just as Walt was finishing a cup of lukewarm coffee and sorting through the forms Blake asked him to gather. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, a Richmond area code, but not one he recognized. He considered letting it ring, but something in his gut nudged him to answer. "Mr. Jennings," a calm professional voice asked. "This is Daniel Brooks over at Commonwealth National Bank. I'm calling to verify some details regarding your new joint account application." Walt froze, the pen in his hand slipping slightly. "What joint account?" he asked slowly. There was a pause, long enough for Walt to imagine the banker straightening in his chair, sensing trouble. "According to the request submitted this morning, you and your daughter-in-law, Melissa Jennings, opened a joint account that would give her access to—" He stopped himself. "But I had a feeling something was off." Walt's pulse hammered. "I didn't open anything. I didn't authorize anything. I didn't sign anything." "That's what I suspected," Daniel said. "The signatures, they didn't match your historical documents. And the urgency with which she wanted the transfer, it raised red flags." A cold wave slid through Walt's body, tightening every muscle. Melissa wasn't done. Breaking into his home hadn't been enough. Now she was trying to drain him dry through the banking system. "Thank you for calling me," Walt said, steadying himself. "Please freeze whatever she requested, and put a fraud alert on all my accounts." "Absolutely," Daniel replied. "We'll block all pending activity and require in-person verification for anything moving forward. You may want to consider changing passwords and security questions as well." "I will," Walt said. "And Daniel, thank you for trusting your instincts." The call ended, but the tremor in Walt's hands didn't. He stood in the middle of the living room, breathing slow, reminding himself that catching this attempt wasn't luck. It was vigilance. It was listening to the small alarms inside him that had been ringing since the first threat. But he didn't have long to gather himself. Less than 40 minutes later, the pounding began. And 3 heavy blows against the front door, loud enough to rattle the frame, then another, and another. Walt's heart thudded. He walked to the window, lifting the corner of the curtain. Andrew was on the porch, red-faced and vibrating with anger, pacing like a storm contained in too small a space. He slammed his fist against the door again. "Open up," he shouted. "Open the damn door right now." Walt didn't move. He simply unlocked the screen door and stepped onto the porch, keeping a safe distance, his phone recorder already running in his pocket. Andrew spun toward him, fury blazing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he yelled. "Why did the bank call me? Why did they freeze the account?" "Because it wasn't your account," Walt said evenly. "And it was Melissa's either." Andrew scoffed, stepping closer. "You're so paranoid you think everything's an attack. We were trying to help you manage your money before you screw everything up." Walt didn't answer. He didn't need to. Carl Benton, standing across the street by his mailbox, raised his phone and began recording. His voice carried over the quiet neighborhood air. "Just making sure everything's documented, Walt. You're not alone." Andrew whirled around, shouting, "Mind your own business, old man." Carl did lower the camera. "This is my business when you threaten your father." A vein pulsed in Andrew's neck. He turned back to Walt, pointing an accusatory finger inches from his face. "You think you're smart, blocking everything. You think you're going to win this. You're not. You're done without me." Walt inhaled, grounding himself, then lifted the small recorder from his pocket and held it up between them like a line drawn in the dirt. "I'm done with secrets," he said quietly. "Done with lies. Done pretending I don't know what you and Melissa are doing." Andrew's face shifted, shock, then anger, then a flicker of fear that he tried to smother. "You're recording me," he barked. "Jesus, Dad, you're completely losing it." "No," Walt said. "For the first time in months, I'm finally clear." Andrew stepped back, running a hand through his hair, pacing in frantic, jerky movements. "This isn't over," he said, voice hoarse and trembling. "A judge is going to fix this. You can't keep blocking us. You can't stop what's coming." He jabbed a finger toward the house one last time before storming down the walkway, kicking over Walt's garbage bin on his way to the car. Carl crossed the street slowly once the engine roared away. "You all right?" he asked. Walt nodded, though the tremor in his chest hadn't eased. "It's getting worse," he murmured. Carl nodded, eyes narrowed. "Yeah, but you've got evidence, and enemies who are finally showing their hand." As Carl walked him back toward the porch, Walt looked down at the recorder still warm in his palm. Andrew was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. Blake Morgan's office looked different when Walt walked in that afternoon, not physically but in atmosphere. The blinds were drawn halfway, the overhead lights dimmer, the air heavier with the quiet tension of a war room. Blake had cleared both desks, spreading out documents like battlefield maps, printed voicemails, transcribed messages, time-stamped screenshots of camera footage. Even the blurry still frame of Melissa slipping into Walt's house at 2:17 a.m. "Sit," Blake said, but not unkindly. He was in legal combat mode now, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched at the tip of his nose. "We need to get organized. They're building a narrative. We're building a counterstrike." For the next hour, Blake sorted through everything Walt had collected, every voicemail Andrew left, every threatening text, every clip from the security cameras. He arranged them into neat stacks, almost surgical in their precision. "This is good," Blake murmured. "This paints the picture, not just conflict pattern of manipulation, coercion, intent." Walt sat back, letting the weight of what was happening settle deeper into him. His life, 7 decades of work, love, and quiet living, was now being distilled into exhibits. As Blake reached for another sheet of paper, his office door cracked open. Detective Corinne Doyle stepped inside. "Got something for you," she said, lifting a thin folder between 2 fingers. Blake gestured her in. "Please tell me it's what I hope it is." "Oh, it is," Doyle said, setting the folder on the desk. "Melissa Jennings, real name Melissa Hartwell from before she married your son. Look at the last page." Blake flipped immediately. Walt watched as his lawyer's face hardened, eyebrows rising. "A fraud charge?" Blake asked. "Attempted fraud in North Carolina," Doyle confirmed. "Years ago. Not enough evidence for conviction, but she was investigated for forging medical records for an elderly employer. Very similar pattern." Walt felt the air shift around him. "You're saying she's done this before?" I'm saying she's capable of doing exactly what she's doing. Gee now, Doyle said. Judges don't take kindly to repeat behavior, especially with vulnerable adults. Walt rubbed his hands together, absorbing the information. The pieces were lining up. The fraud attempt, the forced guardianship filing, the break-in, the bank stunt. Melissa had been rehearsing this grift long before she ever met Walt. Doyle closed the folder. You have more leverage than you think, she said. But you need your story organized. Judges like clarity. I know, Walt said. I'm working on it. And he was. Every night since the confrontation, Walt had been writing. Long lists, bullet points, memories, dates. But now he needed to turn it into something coherent. Something a court could follow. Something that proved he wasn't the confused old man Andrew claimed he was. That night he sat alone in his kitchen with a cup of tea and spread a stack of papers across the table. He wrote out a full timeline, beginning months earlier when Andrew first asked for help with bills, leading to the escalating demands, the lies, the manipulation. He documented every incident with meticulous accuracy. Halfway through, his hand brushed an old wooden box tucked at the back of a drawer. Martha's letters. He hadn't opened that box in years. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside were dozens of envelopes, filled with her looping handwriting, notes she wrote him during their marriage, small reminders of love and resilience. One letter caught his eye, dated during a difficult year when Andrew was still a teenager. Walt, you have the biggest heart I've ever known, but don't let that heart be taken advantage of. You protect people because that's who you are. One day you may have to protect yourself from someone you love. When that day comes, stand firm, for both of us. Walt closed his eyes as the words settled over him like a hand on his shoulder. She had seen something even then. She had known his weakness, his willingness to forgive too easily, to ignore the flaws of the people he cared about most. He folded the letter, placed it in his pocket, and kept writing. By morning, the timeline was complete. But the battle wasn't limited to the documents. Andrew had found a new front. Extended family. Walt's phone buzzed with messages from cousins, nieces, a brother-in-law he hadn't spoken to in years. All variations of the same concern. Andrew says you're struggling. He says you shouldn't be alone. He told us you threatened him. Walt pinched the bridge of his nose. Andrew was rewriting the story before Walt could even defend himself. Later that day, Carl knocked on the door, carrying a notepad filled with handwritten names. What's this? Walt asked. Neighbors, Carl said. People willing to vouch for you. People who have seen you walking every morning, fixing your gutters, doing your own grocery run. Hell, Walt, you're sharper than half the folks on this street. I told them what's happening. They want to testify. Walt stared at the list, overwhelmed. Carl continued, you may not have family standing with you right now, but you've got a community. Walt swallowed hard. Thank you, Carl. The old man gave a simple nod. We're not letting them steamroll you. That night, as Walt prepared the documents for Blake and looked over the list Carl had brought, he felt the pressure growing, like a storm tightening across the horizon. The courtroom battle wasn't distant anymore. It was coming, and every instinct told him. This would be the fight of his life. Walt wasn't expecting Detective Doyle to show up on his porch that morning. He'd barely finished tightening the last screw on a loose gutter panel when her unmarked car pulled into his driveway, tires crunching softly against the gravel. She stepped out with a folder tucked under one arm, her posture straighter than usual, her expression controlled but charged with purpose. Walt, she said, nodding for him to join her inside, we need to talk. He led her to the kitchen, the place that had become the unofficial meeting room for every crisis of the past few weeks. Doyle set the folder on the table but didn't open it right away. Instead, she took a measured breath. I found something you need to hear, she said. Walt felt his body tense. Is it about Andrew? Partly, Doyle replied, but it's mostly about Melissa. The way she said the name, flat, cautious, made Walt's stomach tighten. Doyle finally opened the folder and slid a small flash drive across the table. This was recovered from Melissa's cloud backup. She tried to delete it. She didn't succeed. Walt hesitated only a moment before he plugged it into his laptop. A single audio file appeared. Doyle leaned back slightly, giving him space. "Press play," she said. He did. Immediately, Melissa's voice filled the kitchen. Quiet, controlled, dripping with calculated confidence. "Andrew," she whispered sharply, "once he's ruled incompetent, we sell everything. Fast, before anyone challenges it. The house, the land, the accounts. Al. All of it." There was a rustle in the background, Andrew shifting, anxious. "Sell everything," he repeated, voice unsteady. "We're not selling the house. That's supposed to come to me." Melissa's dismissive laugh crackled through the speakers. "Don't be naive. If your father is deemed unfit, the assets transfer under guardianship. I control the process. We liquidate, then decide how much we share." A pause. "If we share." The words hit Walt like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. Beside him, Doyle remained still, eyes steady. Andrew's voice sounded again, higher, panicked. "What do you mean if we share? We're in this together." "Are we?" Melissa replied coolly. "Because you've barely held onto a job. You spend faster than you think. I'm not risking my future because you can't manage money." Walt watched Andrew's face in his mind. How trusting he'd always been with her, how easily manipulated, how blindly loyal. And here she was, carving him out of the plan without hesitation. The recording continued. Papers shuffled, a man cleared his throat. Another voice, unfamiliar, entered the conversation. "So," the man said, "are we agreed on the sale price? If we move quickly, I can put down a cash deposit for the home within the week." Walt's breath caught. Melissa was negotiating to sell his house. His house. The home he built with Martha. The home where Andrew took his first steps. The home where every photograph, memory, and piece of his life still lived. The conversation ended abruptly. Melissa telling the man she needed to finalize the incompetency ruling before scheduling a sale date, and the audio clicked off. Walt sat back, stunned into silence. For a long moment, only the sound of the refrigerator hum filled the room. Doyle broke the quiet first. She knew exactly what she was doing. She's not just manipulative, she's strategic. And she was planning to cut Andrew out the moment the assets were in her control. Walt swallowed hard, and Andrew didn't know. "No," Doyle said, "but he knows now. We interviewed the real estate investor this morning. He admitted Melissa said Andrew didn't need to know until the paperwork was finalized." Walt imagined Andrew hearing that. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sting of realizing the person he fought for, turned against his own father for, was preparing to discard him like a used match. "So," Walt said slowly, "this recording, how strong is it?" Doyle's eyes sharpened. "Devastating. It proves intent to defraud, motivated guardianship, financial exploitation. It destroys their narrative entirely. But you'll want Morgan to walk you through how to use it in court." As if summoned, Walt's phone buzzed. Blake's name flashed across the screen. Doyle nodded toward it. "Answer, he knows." Walt picked up, voice low. "Blake." "I got the file," Blake said without preamble. "Walt, this is it. This destroys their case, completely. Melissa's credibility is gone. Andrew's claim collapses with hers." Walt closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of Blake's words. For weeks he had been outmaneuvered, cornered, accused, stripped of dignity. But now the truth wasn't just on his side. It was recorded. Cold, clear, undeniable. Blake continued, "This is enough to turn everything around, from defense to offense." Walt didn't speak right away. He let the silence settle, feeling the slow ignition of something deep inside, something he hadn't felt since the beginning of this nightmare. Power, not vengeance, not rage. Power grounded in truth. He opened his eyes. Doyle watched him, recognizing the shift. "Walt," she said calmly, "this is where things change." He nodded slowly, a quiet steel forming in his voice. "Then let's change them." Because for the first time since his life began unraveling, Walt saw the path forward clearly. And his quiet revenge, measured, lawful, unstoppable, had just begun. The courtroom felt colder than Walt expected, too bright, too sterile, too public for something so deeply personal. Rows of polished benches stretched back toward the gallery where neighbors, a few distant relatives, and curious onlookers had gathered. Walt took his seat beside Blake Morgan, keeping his breathing steady, his hands folded purposefully in his lap. He refused to fidget. He refused to look frail. Because frailty was exactly what Andrew and Melissa were hoping to paint onto him today. Across the aisle, Andrew sat rigid, jaw clenched, suit wrinkled as though he'd slept in it. Melissa was beside him, dabbing her eyes with a tissue at carefully timed intervals. She looked like a grieving widow from a courtroom drama, tragic, concerned, entirely false. The judge entered, everyone rose, the session began. It didn't take long for Andrew to start spinning his story. "Your Honor," he said, standing at the podium with an air of forced solemnity, "my father is unable to manage his finances. He's become forgetful, confused, vulnerable to scams. We're simply trying to protect him." Walt's jaw tightened. The lies didn't surprise him anymore, but hearing them so confidently delivered, so smoothly rehearsed, cut deeper than he expected. "And what evidence do you have of this alleged decline?" the judge asked. Andrew cleared his throat. "Your Honor, he misplaces important documents. He forgets conversations. He repeated the same story 3 times during dinner last month." He risked a glance toward Walt. "It's getting worse." Melissa stepped forward next, her voice trembling just enough to seem believable. We love Walt," she said softly, "but he's struggling. He left the stove on twice in 1 week. He forgot where he parked at the grocery store. He yelled at me for no reason." Walt stared at her, stunned by the ease with which she lied. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She dabbed her eyes again, letting the silence work in her favor. She was building a character, him, not as he was but as she needed him to appear. Blake leaned close and whispered, "Let them finish. Then we dismantle." When Melissa stepped back, the judge turned to Blake. "Mr. Morgan, your response." Blake rose with calm assurance, a slight smile curling at the corner of his mouth, the smile of a man holding a hidden ace. "Your Honor," Blake began, "the petitioner's claims are not just exaggerated, they are deliberately misleading. My client is fully competent, and we have evidence." He pressed a button on his tablet. "I'd like to play an audio recording." Andrew stiffened. Melissa's shoulders jerked. The courtroom speakers crackled for half a second. Then Andrew's voice exploded through them, raw, unfiltered, furious. "Your money belongs to me, you old fool." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. Even the court stenographer paused, fingers hovering midair. The recording continued. Andrew's escalating rage, Melissa's false sympathy, the manipulation woven into every word. The judge's face hardened with every second. When it ended, silence swallowed the room. Andrew stared straight ahead, pale as paper. Melissa's hands trembled, but not from emotion. Rage simmered beneath her composure. She shot Walt a look that could have cut steel. Blake let the silence burn before he spoke again. "This does not sound like a concerned son. This sounds like financial coercion." The judge nodded slowly. "Agreed. Do you have further evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor, Detective Doyle does." Detective Corinne Doyle rose from her seat near the back and approached the stand. She carried the folder containing Melissa's forged doctor reports, documents the guardianship filing had relied on. These, Doyle said clearly, laying them out one by one, were submitted as medical evaluations of Mr. Jennings. They are fake. The listed physician did not write them. The signatures were forged, and the content matches a known fraud pattern associated with Mrs. Melissa Jennings. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Melissa's face twitched, just once, before she forced her expression back into something neutral. Andrew looked at her then, truly looked, realization creeping onto his face like a spreading crack in a foundation. He hadn't known. He hadn't known she planned to cut him out. Didn't know she negotiated to sell the house. Didn't know he was being used as much as he was being weaponized. The judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Mrs. Jennings," he said slowly, "do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted between Doyle, Blake, and the judge, calculating, searching for an angle that no longer existed. "Very well," the judge said. "Given the evidence presented, this court is ordering a full investigation into the petitioner's claims and the validity of all documents submitted." He paused, gaze landing directly on Andrew. "And until that investigation is complete, the guardianship petition is suspended." Walt felt the tension in his chest loosen for the first time in weeks, but Blake didn't smile, and neither did Doyle. The judge's voice took on a deeper gravity. "This case," he said, "is far from over." Andrew slumped into his seat. Melissa stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles trembled. Walt watched them both, knowing one thing with absolute clarity. The firestorm had only begun, and the next round would be even more dangerous. The courthouse hallways looked different the second time Walt walked them. The first hearing had felt like a siege, ambush, accusation, the threat of losing control over his own life. But today carried a quieter tension, the kind that comes before a decisive shift. Blake walked beside him, calm as always, a binder under his arm. "The judge ordered an independent evaluator who has no connection to either side," Blake reminded him. "This is good. No bias, no manipulation, just facts." Walt nodded, though he didn't need reassurance. For weeks, he had lived under a cloud of fabricated decline, treated like a man shrinking into confusion. But he knew his mind was still sharp, and after everything Andrew and Melissa had done, he was ready to prove it. Inside a small evaluation room, the court-appointed specialist, a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and a firm handshake, introduced herself. She administered memory tests, reasoning problems, financial judgment scenarios, orientation questions, assessment interviews. Walt approached each task with focus, answering calmly, demonstrating the same meticulous attention he once used in his accounting career. Halfway through, the evaluator smiled softly. "Mr. Jennings, you're doing exceptionally well." Walt didn't smile back. "I should be. I've spent a lifetime keeping things in order." By the end of the session, she thanked him and escorted him out. "I'll report my findings to the judge directly," she said. "But I can tell you now, there is no cognitive decline." Walt exhaled slowly, a controlled release of relief, pride, and something deeper, vindication. Back in the courtroom, Andrew sat at the petitioner's table, fidgeting with his tie. He looked worn, drained, less polished than before. Melissa sat beside him stiffly, arms crossed, avoiding everyone's gaze. The judge entered, everyone stood. "We will review the evaluator's findings," the judge announced, "then hear additional argument." The evaluator approached the stand, raised her right hand, swore in, and delivered her assessment cleanly. "In my professional opinion, Mr. Walter Jennings exhibits full cognitive function. He is mentally competent, financially aware, and capable of independent decision-making. There is no indication of decline." Andrew's head snapped toward her. Melissa's jaw tensed as if she'd bitten down on something sharp. The judge nodded. "Thank you, that will be entered into the record." He turned to Andrew. Mr. Jennings, your petition claims your father is mentally deteriorating. Please present your evidence. Andrew rose, visibly rattled. Your Honor, he forgets things. He repeats himself. He misplaces paperwork. The judge raised a hand. Evidence, Mr. Jennings, not opinions. Andrew swallowed hard. I don't have documents, but I know what I've seen. You submitted forged medical reports, the judge reminded him. That was, Andrew faltered. That was Melissa's idea. Beside him, Melissa's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. Blake leaned over to Walt and whispered, They're splintering. The judge turned to Melissa. Mrs. Jennings, would you like to testify? Melissa lifted her chin. No, Your Honor. On advice of counsel, I invoke my rights. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Shock, suspicion, recognition. The judge made note of it. Very well, he said. The court finds the petitioner has failed to provide credible evidence of cognitive decline. In fact, the material presented suggests deliberate manipulation of the guardianship system. Walt felt his spine straighten, a warmth rising through his chest. He didn't smile, he didn't speak, but the truth settled around him like armor. The judge continued, voice firm. The guardianship claim filed by Andrew Jennings is hereby suspended indefinitely pending further review. Andrew sank into his chair as though his legs had given out. Melissa stared straight ahead, teeth clenched, refusing to look at anyone, not even Andrew. The judge added, additionally, the court will examine the potential misuse of forged documentation in this case. Blake glanced at Walt, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. When court adjourned, Walt stood, picked up his coat and walked toward the aisle. Andrew rose as if to say something, maybe an apology, maybe another lie, maybe a plea. But Walt didn't pause. He walked past his son without turning his head, without offering a glance, without giving him even a fragment of acknowledgement. The message was clear. The power had shifted. Andrew watched him go, face pale, caught somewhere between fear and realization. Realization that the narrative he tried to construct had collapsed, that the father he underestimated had stood taller than he ever expected. When Walt reached the doors leading to the hallway, he felt the weight of months begin to shift off his shoulders. But he also knew something else. They weren't finished. Not yet. The courtroom felt heavier this time, not chaotic, not fiery, just thick with the residue of truth closing in on someone who had run out of places to hide. Walt sat beside Blake Morgan, shoulders relaxed, posture steady. He had learned something in these last weeks. Stillness could be stronger than shouting, and truth, real, documented truth, had its own gravitational pull. Across the room, Andrew couldn't sit still. His knee bounced, his fingers drummed on the table, and sweat gathered at his temple despite the cool courtroom air. Melissa, noticeably absent today, had left him to face the unraveling alone. Without her rehearsed expressions and whispered coaching, Andrew looked smaller, like a boy pretending to be a man he didn't understand. The judge looked down at the file. Mr. Jennings, he said, you stated you had new information to present regarding your father's estate and alleged agreements. Andrew stood quickly, too quickly, nearly knocking over his chair. He forced a breath, trying to settle into confidence that no longer belonged to him. Yes, Your Honor, he said. My father, he promised me early access to my inheritance. He said I'd get the house, and some of the savings, years ago, he made those promises. Blake didn't react, Walt didn't react, but the judge raised an eyebrow. And you have proof of this agreement? The judge asked. Andrew swallowed. No written proof, but he said it many times. Blake pushed back his chair and rose with the soft authority of a man who knew precisely when to strike. Your Honor, he said, we would like to submit a counter-evidence packet. He handed the judge a neatly bound folder. Inside, spreadsheets, bank statements, and security logs glinted under the fluorescent lights. For the last 18 months, Blake continued, Andrew Jennings had unauthorized access to his father's personal accounts. Our forensic accountant verified repeated withdrawals totaling. He paused only for effect. $18,000. Gasps murmured from the gallery. Andrew's face flushed red, then white, then red again. That was a loan, he stammered. Dad said it was okay. Walt didn't move, didn't blink. Blake shook his head. If that were true, Mr. Jennings, why did you disguise the withdrawals as online purchases? Why route them through temporary accounts? Why delete the email alerts? Andrew opened his mouth, but no explanation formed. The judge flipped through the logs. This is concerning. And there's more, Blake said, stepping aside so Detective Doyle could approach. She carried a slim folder, one that looked deceptively light for the weight of what it contained. Doyle greeted the judge and turned to the courtroom. In our investigation, she said, we obtained phone and message records that show Melissa Jennings coached Andrew on how to structure and deliver his claims. She instructed him on phrases to use, symptoms to describe, and how to exaggerate normal behaviors into signs of cognitive decline. She handed copies to the judge. In one message, Doyle continued, Melissa rot. Stick to the memory angle. Say he forgot bills. Say he repeated things. Judges fall for that. Another rustle of shock filled the room. Andrew shook his head violently. She only meant she was helping. She didn't. His words collided with each other, collapsing before they could form a defense. Doyle's voice remained steady. Mr. Jennings, do you deny your wife coached you? Andrew ran a hand through his hair, wild and panicked. I know, yes, she just, look, I'm trying to protect my dad. He promised me things. He owed me. You don't understand. The judge leaned back. Mr. Jennings, you've provided no proof of any promise, but we do have proof of theft, coercion, and attempts to deceive this court. Andrew's breath quickened. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. That was when Walt finally spoke. He rose only slightly enough for his voice to carry. Calm, controlled, a tone grounded in heartbreak, not anger. Andrew, he said softly, I taught you better. The words struck harder than any accusation. They weren't loud, they weren't sharp, but they were devastating. Andrew froze, tears suddenly welling in his eyes. He shook his head like he could outrun the truth closing in. No, Dad, you don't get it. I need it. He blinked rapidly, but the lies still came, reflex, habit, desperation. She told me it was the only way. I didn't mean to. You forced me to. His sentence broke apart, incoherent. The judge watched him with a stern, measured expression. Mr. Jennings, the judge said firmly, this court has serious concerns about your behavior. Continued dishonesty in these proceedings may result in criminal charges. Andrew sank into his seat, trembling, eyes darting between Walt, the judge, and the floor as if searching for someplace safer to look. But there was no safe ground left. Blake sat back down beside Walt, exhaling slowly. The tide's turned, he whispered. He's losing his narrative. Walt didn't answer. He watched his son, broken, cornered, unraveling, and felt a weight settle in his chest. Not victory, not satisfaction. Just the solemn recognition that truth, once released, couldn't be put back in the box. And the consequences were only beginning. The sun had barely set when the pounding began, fierce, uneven blows that rattled the front door like someone was trying to break it off its hinges. Walt had just finished washing dishes, the soft clinking of plates replaced by the violent echo of fists slamming wood. He froze. He knew that rhythm. He'd heard it half a dozen times since the guardianship filing, the knocking that wasn't knocking, the pounding of a man who came demanding, not asking. He stepped toward the door cautiously. Through the window's edge, he saw Andrew swaying on the porch, his posture sloppy, his movements jagged. Even from inside, the stench of alcohol seemed to seep through the glass. Dad, Andrew shouted, slapping his palm against the doorframe. Open up, we're talking now. Walt didn't unlock it. "Andrew, go home, you're drunk." Andrew laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "Yeah, I'm drunk because of you, because you ruined everything." He slammed the door again, harder this time, rattling the pictures on the wall. "You destroyed my marriage," he shouted. "Do you hear me? You destroyed it." She left. She packed her bags and left because of what you did in court. Walt's heart tightened. "Andrew, Melissa didn't leave because of me. She left because you found out who she really was." "That's a lie," Andrew barked. "You turned the judge against us. You made her look guilty, you." His words slurred into each other, anger melting into grief and then back into fury. Before Walt could respond, a car screeched to a stop outside. Headlights washed across the yard. A door slammed. "Melissa." She stepped out wearing a tight coat, makeup smudged, eyes wild with a mix of rage and desperation. She stormed up the lawn toward Andrew, grabbing his arm. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "You're ruining everything." Andrew yanked his arm free. "Me? You lied to me. You tried to sell his house without telling me. You were going to cut me out." Melissa's face contorted. "You idiot. You were supposed to keep quiet. You were supposed to hold it together." "I lost everything because of you," Andrew screamed. "You lost everything because you're weak," she fired back. Their shouting escalated like gasoline meeting a flame. Within seconds, Andrew shoved her. Melissa shoved back harder. It spiraled into a frantic, messy fight, arms flailing, voices cracking, the kind of chaos that belonged in police reports, not suburban front yards. Walt stepped onto the porch, hands raised. "Stop, both of you, this isn't helping anything." Melissa turned on him instantly. "This is your fault, you manipulative old bastard. You want him to hate me." Andrew lunged at her again, stumbling, grabbing her coat. She slapped him across the face. He shoved her backward and she fell into the damp grass, screaming curses. At that moment, Carl Benton came rushing out of his house, phone already recording. "Hey," he shouted. "Enough, Walt, stay back." Seconds later, another car pulled up, Detective Doyle's cruiser. She stepped out fast, hand on her holster but not drawing, assessing the situation with the speed of someone who'd seen domestic violence unravel in seconds. "Enough," Doyle barked, voice sharp like a cracking whip. "Both of you step away from each other." Andrew stumbled backward, chest heaving. Melissa scrambled to her feet, hair wild, eyes darting like an animal cornered. Doyle pointed at Andrew. "You, hands where I can see them." Andrew complied, shaking. Then she turned to Melissa. "Melissa Jennings, step forward." Melissa scoffed. "Why, I didn't do anything, he assaulted me." Carl lowered his phone. "Detective, I got it all on video." Doyle didn't even need it. She looked Melissa dead in the eye. "We already have more than enough. The forged documents, the attempted financial theft, the break-in, the deleted recordings." Melissa's face drained of color. "You're under arrest for fraud and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult," Doyle said, reaching for her cuffs. "No, no, you can't do this, Andrew. Tell her, Andrew." Melissa shrieked as Doyle pulled her arms behind her back. But Andrew didn't move. He just stood there, deflated, watching the only person he thought he could rely on being taken away in handcuffs. As Doyle guided Melissa toward the cruiser, Andrew suddenly pointed a shaking finger at Walt. "This isn't over," he said, voice ragged. "You hear me? A judge is gonna make this right. You can't just erase me. You'll regret this." Walt looked at him, not with anger, not even with fear, just a hollow sadness that settled deep in his bones. "I never wanted this, Andrew," he said quietly, "but you didn't give me a choice." Andrew blinked, his expression collapsing into confusion, grief, fury, none of it forming into anything coherent. He stumbled backward toward his car, hands trembling, eyes glassy. Carl stepped beside Walt, steady as a pillar. "You did what you had to," Carl murmured. Walt didn't answer. He watched the cruiser door shut on Melissa, watched Andrew sway beside his car, watched the remnants of his family fracture under the weight of their own choices. Heartbroken, but resolute, because tomorrow the legal fallout would begin. And this was only the final spark before the explosion. Walt sat in Blake Morgan's office again, the same mahogany table, the same framed law degrees, but the air felt heavier, thick with the aftermath of Melissa's arrest and the broken pieces of Andrew's unraveling. Blake had called him in urgently, asking him to come alone. No explanation, no hint, just a tone in his voice Walt had never heard before, something between gravity and apology. Blake closed the office door behind them, walked to his desk, and set down a slim, faded leather folder. It looked old, older than Blake, older than Walt's own retirement papers. The edges were worn, the leather cracked, as if it had waited decades to be opened again. "Walt," Blake said, pulling out the chair across from him, "I need you to sit." Walt did, slowly. Blake took a breath. "What I'm about to show you, your father intended for you to know eventually, but he asked me to keep it sealed until certain conditions were met." Walt frowned. "My father, Blake, Dad's been gone 40 years. "I know," Blake said, "but he planned for the long game." He opened the folder. Inside were documents stamped with dates from the early 1980s, bank statements, letters, account authorizations. Walt leaned forward, heart tightening as he saw the signature at the bottom of the first page. Tom Jennings. His father. Blake slid the top sheet toward him. "Walt, your father left you a second inheritance account, separate from the one you already received when he passed." Walt blinked, confusion clouding his face. "A second inheritance? Why didn't I know about it?" "Because he didn't want Andrew to know," Blake said quietly. "He feared what your son might become, even back then." Walt's breath hitched. Blake continued, voice gentle but unwavering. "Your father asked me to keep this sealed until either you turned 70 or until Andrew displayed behavior proving Tom's concerns were justified." Walt stared at him, stunned. "He predicted this. He predicted all of this." Blake nodded slowly. "He wrote you a letter." He pulled out an envelope, yellowed at the corners. Walt recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's sharp, deliberate cursive. His throat tightened as he unfolded the paper. "Walt," the letter began, "you have always been a better man than me, patient, forgiving, generous to a fault. But your kindness could one day be your undoing. I see something in Andrew, a hunger for what he has not earned, a belief that what is yours is his by right. I pray he grows out of it, but if he does not, then this account is my protection. One day your salvation." Walt's eyes blurred. He kept reading. "You must never tell him about this money. Not until he proves he values you more than he values what you leave behind." The words cut deeper than any wound Andrew had inflicted, because this wasn't recent. This wasn't sudden. This was a shadow his father had seen long before Walt ever knew to look. He lowered the letter, hands trembling. "I failed him," Walt whispered. "I didn't teach him right. I didn't correct him early enough." Blake shook his head softly. "Tom didn't think you failed him. He thought you loved him more than he deserved. And maybe that was the problem." Walt closed his eyes, letting the grief wash over him. A grief not for the money, but for the decades of blindness, the years of hope that Andrew would become someone else, someone better. "How much is in the account?" Walt finally asked. Blake hesitated only a moment. "As of last month's calculation, $3.2 million. Walt didn't speak, couldn't. The number didn't feel real, not because of its size, but because it represented his father's distrust, his foresight, his warning. A knock on the office door interrupted the silence. A court clerk stepped in, handing Blake a new envelope. "For the Jennings hearing, sir." Blake thanked him and opened it. Inside was the judge's written notice regarding Andrew's petition. Blake scanned it, then looked up at Walt. "He's barred." Walt blinked. "Barred from what?" "From accessing any part of your estate," Blake said. present or future. The judge says Andrew's behavior disqualifies him from serving as guardian, beneficiary, advocate, or executor, permanently. Walt felt something settle inside him, not triumph, not satisfaction, but a deep, heavy finality, a door closing that he had spent years trying to keep open. But the news didn't reach Andrew gently. An hour later, Andrew burst into the courthouse conference room where Walt and Blake were reviewing filings. His face was flushed, eyes red from crying or anger, likely both. "You hid money from me," Andrew shouted. $3 million. You kept that from me my whole life." Blake stood protectively between them, but Walt raised a hand. "Andrew," he said quietly, "your grandfather kept it from you, not me." Andrew staggered backward, shaking his head violently. "No, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to shut me out. I'm your son." Walt met his gaze, steady, sorrowful, unwavering. "And you tried to take everything from me." Andrew's face crumpled. "You don't understand," he whispered hoarsely. "I needed it. I thought it would make everything right." Walt let out a long, trembling breath. "Money doesn't make a man right, Andrew. Character does." Andrew sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. He looked broken, not because of the money itself, but because the last thread of his imagined entitlement had snapped beyond repair. The judge's order lay on the table between them, a line drawn in ink, final and unquestionable. Andrew had no access to the inheritance, to the house, to anything. Blake closed the folder and looked at Walt. "This changes everything. You're protected now." Walt nodded slowly. For the first time, he finally saw it clearly, not just who Andrew had become, but who he had always been, and who Walt needed to be moving forward. The courtroom battle wasn't over yet, but the power had shifted forever. The courthouse felt strangely quiet the morning Walt filed the no-contact order. Not hostile, not heavy, just quiet, as if even the walls understood what this moment meant for him. Blake walked beside him carrying a thin stack of finalized documents, but the emotional weight of them was far from thin. "You're sure you want this permanent?" Blake asked gently as they reached the clerk's counter. Walt nodded. "I've been sure for a long time. I just wasn't ready to admit it." The clerk reviewed the paperwork, stamped each page with a loud, decisive thud, and slid copies back across the counter. "Mr. Jennings," she said, "once this is processed, Andrew and Melissa are legally barred from contacting you in any form. Phone calls, visits, messages, anything becomes a criminal violation." Walt breathed out slowly. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something closer to release, the loosening of a rope that had been wrapped around his chest for months, pulled tight by betrayal and heartbreak. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. As he stepped outside into the cool mid-morning air, clouds drifting lazily overhead, Walt felt the magnitude of the moment settle over him. He had severed the last tether. The legal war wasn't fully over, but the personal war, the one clawing at his heart, had taken its final blow. He climbed into his truck, dialed his phone, and waited for Blake to pick up. "Next step," Walt said, steadying himself. "Let's finish restructuring the estate." Blake's voice warmed. "Already prepared. When do you want to sign?" "Ode," Walt said. "I want everything locked down today." By afternoon, they were seated in Blake's office again, reviewing trust documents, inheritance allocations, and protective clauses strong enough to withstand any future attack, even 1 decade away. "I've divided the assets the way I want," Walt told him. "The primary estate stays in a protected trust, and the second inheritance that needs a different purpose." Blake nodded. "You mentioned charity." Walt looked out the window at the city below, people walking, living, struggling, surviving. "Yes, Martha always said money should help people who haven't had the breaks we did. I want part of the inheritance to fund scholarships, and part to support the youth center. Blake smiled softly. She'd be proud of that. And the rest, Walt continued, goes into the long-term trust, accessible only if I approve it, no one else. Blake nodded. I'll put everything in motion. Hours later, after the ink dried and the documents were filed, someone knocked on Walt's door just as twilight settled over the neighborhood. Carl Benton stood outside with a folder tucked under his arm and a determined look on his face. "We held a neighborhood meeting," Carl said. "People want you to know they're with you. You're not alone in this." He opened the folder and handed Walt a stack of letters, handwritten notes from neighbors up and down the street. "We've seen you walking your route for years. You're sharp as ever. We heard what Melissa did. We stand with you. Anything you need, Walt, anything." Walt scanned each letter, his throat tightening. He cleared it softly. "I don't know what to say." Carl smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just know you've got people in your corner." Walt set the letters carefully on the hall table, a testament to the power of chosen family. He felt something shift inside him, something warm and fragile, gratitude replacing despair, community replacing isolation. But the consequences for Andrew continued to ripple. 2 days later, Blake called with an update. Andrew's employer was notified of the ongoing investigation, he said. The forged documents, the financial exploitation attempt, it triggered mandatory reporting protocols. Walt closed his eyes briefly. What happened? "He lost his job," Blake said, "effective immediately." Walt didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. A father's heart doesn't stop caring just because the son fails. But he also felt no guilt. Andrew's actions had built this outcome brick by brick, choices made in greed, not desperation. After the call, Walt sat on his porch, letting the stillness settle around him. The wind moved through the trees with a softer voice than it had in months. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for footsteps, for pounding on the door, for another ambush. The world felt quieter. Later that evening, Doyle stopped by to check on him, her presence familiar now, steady. "You holding up?" she asked, leaning against the porch railing. "I think I am," Walt said. "Not all the way, but more than before." Doyle nodded. "The law's on your side now. Everything Melissa did, everything Andrew tried, it's traceable, documented, provable. And now that the no-contact order's in place, you have one less front to worry about." Walt exhaled. "I never thought I'd need protection from my own family." Doyle looked at him with compassion instead of pity. "Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who learn how to cut deepest." Walt turned his gaze toward the quiet street, where the porch lights of neighbors glowed warm and steady. "Do you think it's possible for life to feel normal again?" he asked. Doyle gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Not the old normal, but a new one. Yes, and from what I've seen, you're already starting." She left him with that thought, and Walt remained on the porch, listening to the crickets, the soft rustle of leaves, the calm that now stretched uninterrupted. Peace wasn't fully here yet. But for the first time, it no longer felt impossible. The sky hung low and gray the morning Walt drove to the cemetery, thin winter clouds drifting like slow-moving ghosts over the Richmond hills. The kind of quiet that made every memory feel closer, sharper. He parked beneath the old maple tree Martha always loved, the branches bare now, reaching toward the sky like open hands. Walt walked the familiar path, his breath visible in the cold air. The cemetery wasn't a place of fear for him. It was a place of truth, a place where no one lied, no one demanded, no one betrayed. He stopped at Martha's gravestone, a simple piece of polished granite with her name carved cleanly across it. Martha Jennings, beloved wife, steady heart, 1949–2016. Walt knelt down, brushing a thin layer of frost from the stone with his glove. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered. The words trembled out of him. "It's been a while." He sat back, the cold seeping through his coat, but he didn't move. He needed her today, needed the silence only she could fill. "I messed up," he admitted softly. "I messed up as a father. I didn't see what Andrew was becoming, or I refused to see it." His voice cracked. "Maybe both." He looked at the stone, imagining her warm eyes, her patient smile, the way she used to rest her hand on his shoulder when he spiraled into worry. "I kept giving him the benefit of the doubt," Walt said, "even when the doubts were all I had left." A wind brushed past him, lifting a few dry leaves. He closed his eyes, breathing it in. "I tried to raise him right," he whispered, "but somewhere along the way something broke in him, and I kept blaming myself, even now." A tear slid down his cheek, surprising him with its warmth in the cold morning. "But I think I'm finally understanding what you always tried to tell me." He placed his hand on the stone. "I can't sacrifice myself to save someone who doesn't want to be saved." The truth of that settled inside him, painful but solid. He stayed with her a while longer, speaking quietly about the case, the no-contact order, Melissa's arrest, Blake's support, Carl's loyalty. He talked about the fear he'd carried, the shame, the betrayal. And then slowly he talked about the new things, the small shoots of life growing back through the wreckage. He stood only when the cold began to numb his knees. "I miss you," he whispered, "but I'll try to live in a way you'd be proud of." As he walked back toward the car, his phone buzzed with a notification. He hesitated before checking it. An email. From Andrew. Subject: "Dad, please read this." Walt sat behind the wheel, staring at the glowing screen. For a long moment he considered deleting it unread, but something, perhaps habit, perhaps a lingering sliver of hope, made him open it. The letter was long. Pages of words, apologies, explanations, denial, regret, half confessions, half pleas. Andrew wrote about losing his job, about Melissa abandoning him, about shame, about mistakes, about how he felt confused, trapped, desperate. And then, near the end, "I know I messed up. I know I ruined things, but I'm still your son. Please don't give up on me completely." Walt's throat tightened. He leaned back in the seat, letter open on the screen, his breath heavy. He read every word. And then he closed the email gently. He didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some wounds weren't ready to be revisited. Some bridges were too burnt to cross back over. He started the truck and drove away, leaving the message unopened emotionally, even if he'd opened it technically. Meanwhile, the consequences continued moving forward without him. Blake updated him later that Melissa was facing trial alone, fraud charges, attempted exploitation, falsifying medical records. Every protective instinct Walt once had for Andrew flickered as he imagined Andrew watching her be led into the courtroom in shackles. But that was no longer Walt's burden to carry. He had his own life to rebuild. And strangely, unexpectedly, a new path appeared sooner than he thought. It began with a simple invitation. The local youth center needed volunteers for financial literacy training. Doyle had mentioned it offhandedly during a visit. "You're good at numbers," she'd said. "And some of these kids, they've never had a stable adult teach them anything about money." Walt surprised himself by showing up. The first evening he stood in front of a room full of teenagers, fidgety, restless, cautious. He talked about budgeting, about saving, about respect for what you earn and what you build. And slowly he saw faces change. Eyes sharpen. Hands rise with questions. Afterward, one kid lingered. "Mr. Jennings," he said quietly, "thanks for explaining it without making us feel stupid." Walt smiled, really smiled for the first time in a long time. "You're not stupid," he said. "You just deserve someone who takes the time." He walked out of the youth center into the cool night air, feeling lighter, steadier, not healed, but healing. Piece by piece. The cemetery visit. The letter left unanswered. The volunteering. The quiet return of peace. Life wasn't what it had been, but it was beginning again. And tomorrow, that beginning would continue. The morning sunlight streamed through Walt's kitchen window in a way he hadn't noticed in months, warm, clean, unburdened. He sipped his coffee slowly, the air carrying the quiet hum of a house finally returned to safety. No threats, no pounding on the door, no uncertainty lurking behind every text message. Today, he was signing the last of the documents that would officially open a new chapter of his life. Blake Morgan greeted him at the office with a firm handshake. "You ready?" he asked, motioning toward a neatly organized folder sitting on the conference table. "More than ready," Walt replied, taking his seat. Blake opened the folder and turned the first page toward him. "The scholarship trust is finalized. Funds are set aside, invested, and protected. It'll support local students starting next fall." Walt ran a hand across the page, imagining the faces of kids who'd walked through the youth center doors, kids who were hungry for direction, for someone to tell them they could climb higher than their circumstances. "Martha would have liked this," Walt said quietly. Blake nodded. "It's a beautiful legacy." The next stack of papers detailed the expansion of Walt's estate protections, multiple layers of legal armor, ensuring no one, especially not Andrew, could ever try to seize control again. "You're protected from every angle now," Blake told him. "No loopholes, no backdoors. This is your life, your money, your decisions. No one touches a thing without your approval." For the first time in a long time, Walt felt something settle inside him, not just safety but authority. His own life was back in his hands, fully. When the signing was done, Blake closed the folder with a satisfying thud. "This," he said, "marks the end of their reach." Walt nodded, allowing the weight of those words to sink in. "Thank you for everything, Blake. I couldn't have done this without you." "You did more than you think," Blake replied. "You fought back, most people freeze, you didn't." Back home, Walt turned his attention to the last lingering piece of vulnerability, his house. The one place that had been violated. He hired a security company to transform it from familiar and predictable into fortified and modern. New cameras, reinforced doors, motion sensors, smart locks, and an alert system directly connected to Doyle's precinct. When the installers finished, Walt stepped onto his porch and surveyed the property. The home felt different, not like a fortress, not like a bunker, but like a place he truly owned again. Later that week, Doyle stopped by. Not in uniform this time. Just jeans, a casual jacket, and a relaxed smile. "Thought I'd check in," she said, leaning comfortably against his railing. "Everything in place?" Walt nodded. "Feels like a new house." Her smile softened. "You know, I don't always get cases that end well, or people who come out stronger, but you did. You took the hits and kept standing." Walt chuckled lightly. "Didn't feel like standing half the time." "That's what makes it impressive," Doyle said. Then, after a pause, "You ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. You've got more family here than you realize." It was the kind of statement that didn't need embellishment. It sank into the quiet like truth long overdue. By the next week, with legal affairs complete and the house secure, Walt found himself doing something he hadn't done in months: walking. He stepped out just before sunset, the sky painted in soft oranges and fading blues. The neighborhood felt alive again, neighbors exchanging waves, kids riding bikes, Carl sitting comfortably on his porch with a book. Walt walked his old route, breathing in the cool air, the scent of fireplace smoke drifting from chimneys. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't scanning shadows. He wasn't checking over his shoulder. He wasn't wondering if Andrew's car would appear at the curb or if Melissa was lurking behind some imagined corner. He was simply walking, simply existing, simply free. The fear that once dictated every moment had faded, not erased, not forgotten, but quieted into something manageable, something powerless. As he reached the end of the block, he paused beneath a street lamp and looked up at the darkening sky. A sense of peace settled over him, not a grand revelation, not a triumphant victory music swell, just a steady, honest calm. Control was back in his life, stability in his days, purpose in his evenings. And though the past still lingered, the future felt open again. He turned for home, the night cool but gentle around him, unaware that the next day would bring something he hadn't expected at all. The house was quiet, quiet in a way that didn't sting anymore. Thanksgiving morning slipped in with a muted gray sky, the kind that made the world feel softer, slower. Walt stood in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, whisk in hand as he stirred a small bowl of gravy. No feast, no big gathering, no frantic preparation. Just a simple meal, roast chicken instead of turkey. A smaller pan of stuffing, green beans, and mashed potatoes made the way Martha used to, with extra butter and a pinch of nutmeg. He moved calmly, without hurry, letting the silence fill the gaps where tension once lived. The past months had aged him and sharpened him all at once. Today, he wasn't trying to outrun memories. He wasn't replaying courtroom scenes or arguments at his doorstep. Today, he was simply cooking. As the chicken finished roasting, Walt set the table for one plate, fork, napkin folded neatly. He stood back for a moment, taking in the sight. There had been a time when the single-place setting would have crushed him, but now it felt honest, peaceful, a choice instead of a punishment. He sat, plate warm beneath his fingers, and bowed his head slightly. Not to pray. Martha had always been better at putting gratitude into words, but to acknowledge the year behind him, the betrayals, the battles, the loneliness, and the unexpected strength that rose from the wreckage. He wanted to honor all of it, but not relive it. Before he could take the first bite, a knock sounded at the door, gentle, not demanding. Walt's chest tightened for a moment out of habit, but the tension faded. Hen, he heard a familiar voice. "Hey, Walt," Carl called. "You got room for one more old man?" Walt laughed under his breath, surprising himself. "Doors open," he said, and it was. Carl stepped in holding a foil-covered pie dish. "Pumpkin pie, store-bought," he admitted, "but I sprinkled cinnamon on top so it smells like effort." Walt chuckled, the sound warming the room instantly. "Looks perfect." Carl hung his coat and joined him at the table. "Didn't feel right letting you eat alone today," he said simply. "Figured you might enjoy company, or at least someone to steal part of your dinner." "Well," Walt said, passing him a plate, "you're in luck. I made too much." They ate without rush. They talked about simple things, Carl's new bird feeder, the youth center kids who had started calling Walt Mr. J, the neighbor who'd finally repainted his garage after 10 years of promising to do it. No drama, no legal updates, no family storms brewing in the background. Just two old friends sharing a meal. At one point, Carl raised his fork and pointed it gently at Walt. "You know," he said, "family doesn't always come with matching last names. Sometimes it's the folks who stand with you when things get ugly." Walt looked down at his plate, feeling the truth of those words settle deep in his chest. "I'm beginning to understand that," he said quietly. Carl nodded. "Good, took you long enough." They laughed, real laughter, the kind that shook dust from places grief had lived too long. After the dishes were washed and the pie reduced to crumbs, Carl headed home with a satisfied groan. "If I don't leave now, I'll fall asleep in your chair," he warned. "You're welcome to," Walt said. Yeah, Carl replied, waving him off as he stepped outside. "Happy Thanksgiving, Walt." "Happy Thanksgiving, Carl." When the door closed, the house felt warm again. Not because of the oven, but because of the lingering echo of easy conversation, companionship, and something that had been missing for far too long: genuine comfort. Walt walked back to the table, intending to wipe it down, when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't expected to see. Andrew. A text preview flashed. "Dad, please, I need money, just a little. I'm struggling. Please don't ignore me." Walt stared at the message for a long moment, not with anger, not with guilt, just clarity. He had given enough, emotionally, financially, spiritually. And every time he'd reached out before, he'd been met with taking, not healing. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the message thread, scrolled to the top and pressed block contact. A simple action. A final boundary. A new tradition. Peace over pain, he murmured aloud, letting the words settle in the quiet room. He turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the warm glow of a lamp in the living room. The house no longer felt empty. It felt reclaimed. And as he settled into his armchair with a blanket over his knees, the warmth returned, not from the heater, not from the food, but from the calm certainty that for the first time in a long time, he had chosen himself. Tomorrow held whatever it held. But tonight peace filled the walls again. The first light of morning crept over the rooftops in soft strokes of gold as Walt stepped onto his porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The air was crisp, the kind that brushed gently against the skin and made the world feel newly made. He had always liked sunrise. It felt honest. Not loud, not demanding, just a quiet invitation to start again. He eased into his old rocking chair, its wooden frame creaking in a familiar rhythm. From here he could see the street waking up slowly, a jogger passing by, a dog tugging its owner along, the distant sound of a car engine humming to life. Normalcy, something he had forgotten the shape of, was slowly returning. Walt reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small recorder, the same one he'd carried through every confrontation, every courtroom battle, every moment of doubt. It was scratched now, a little battered but still solid, still faithful. For a long moment he simply held it, thumb tracing the grooves, remembering the first day he flipped it on out of pure self-defense. He hadn't known then just how much this small device would change, protect, reveal. He pressed play. Andrew's voice spilled into the quiet morning, raw and venomous, echoing into the air as though it were happening all over again. "Your money belongs to me, you old fool." The words were no less painful now, but they no longer cut, not the way they once had. They didn't wound, they confirmed. They clarified. They reminded him of the truth he had fought so hard to deny. Love could guide you, but it could not save someone who refused to be saved. He let the recording run its brief course, the venom, the rage, the entitlement, all the evidence of how far Andrew had fallen from the boy he once was. When it ended, the silence that followed was deeper, cleaner, almost peaceful. Walt stared into the rising sun. "I loved you," he whispered into the stillness. "God knows I loved you, but I loved myself enough to protect myself from you." His voice didn't tremble, because the statement wasn't for Andrew. It was for him, for the man who had survived betrayal, for the father who had tried, for the husband Martha knew he could still be, a man who didn't disappear inside someone else's chaos. He opened his laptop, slid the recorder's memory card into the side slot, and transferred the final file, the one that had changed everything. He created a new folder on the desktop and typed the title carefully. "The Day Everything Changed." He moved the recording into the folder and sat back, watching the progress bar complete. It felt ceremonial, like closing the last chapter of a long, bruising book, not erasing it, preserving it, owning it. He closed the laptop gently and leaned back in his chair. The sunlight stretched farther across the porch, warming the wood beneath his feet. And suddenly he felt something he hadn't felt in months, a presence. Not physical, not visible, but unmistakable. Martha. He didn't see her, didn't hear her, didn't imagine her. He simply felt her, like warmth pressing gently against his back, like a hand settled on his shoulder, not urging him forward, but reassuring him that he already was moving forward. "I hope I did right by you," he murmured, voice soft. "I hope I finally learned what you tried so hard to teach me." A faint breeze swept across the porch, lifting the edges of the blanket draped over the arm of his chair. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For the first time since this nightmare began, since Andrew demanded control, since Melissa schemed, since Walt's world shook under the weight of betrayal, he breathed without fear, tightening his chest. Not because the past was forgotten, but because he was no longer living under it. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath empty every corner of his lungs. The sun warmed his face. The breeze whispered through the trees. The neighborhood murmured back to life. And Walt Jennings, father, widower, survivor, finally felt at peace. He opened his eyes, looked toward the horizon, and allowed a quiet, resolute smile to form. He said my money belonged to him. He didn't know I recorded the moment I took my life back.